Chapter 5. A Whip Round for Mr. Bond. Trudy escorted Bond to a small vehicle like a golf buggy, and they drove away down the gravel drive. Bond had the impression that her eyes were watching him from behind the tall windows, but he could see nothing. Trudy remained silent, and he sensed that she had been able to read his expression and knew that the interview with Drax had not gone well. He considered questioning her about her relationship with her employer, but decided that this was not the moment to invite such confidences. Later, perhaps. The buggy crossed a bridge at the frontier of the Poplars and left the French resistance behind. Across a stretch of open ground planted with shrubs that had not yet reached maturity was the first of the enormous hangars. Trudy skirted it and arrived at a glass-fronted building that looked as if it housed offices. It reminded Bond of a 3-story mouse cage he had owned when a boy. He almost expected to see a giant exercise treadmill beside the filing cabinets. "This is where I leave you," said Trudy. "You'll find Dr. Goodhead at the end of the passage past the reception desk." "I'll see you tonight," said Bond. "This evening, you mean?" Trudy raised a hand in farewell and glided away towards the chateau without looking back. Bond conquered a sigh and wondered what Dr. Goodhead would be like. Probably some dry-as-dust scientist talking incomprehensibly in technical jargon. The kind of man who could split the atom without discovering how to stop the dandruff that built up on the shoulders of his white coat. Bond entered the building and walked past the empty reception desk and the inevitable iced water dispenser. As he advanced down the corridor, a beautiful girl in a black leotard approached him. Her skin matched the colour of the leotard, and she had a woolen jacket around her shoulders. There were 2 small beads of perspiration above her wickedly curved upper lip, and Bond guessed that she had just returned from a physical workout with the astronaut trainees. She smiled winsomely and moved on her way, the muscles rippling beneath the leotard. Bond felt again a strange sense of unreality. It was difficult to reconcile Renaissance chateau and beautiful girls with mannequin proportions with the ultra-modern technology of a space laboratory. He continued down the corridor and stopped before a door with the name Dr. H. Goodhead, neatly printed in black letters on a white card. Bond knocked. There was no answer. He opened the door and found himself in an outer office with a secretary's desk, filing cabinets and wall charts. The room was empty. The door to the inner office was ajar, and Bond pushed it open. Standing with her back to him was a slim girl wearing a light grey jumpsuit. The back was promising. It was long and ended in a slim waist, giving way to tight, well-rounded buttocks and legs that covered many graceful inches before they reached the floor. The shoulders sloped gently, and the white flesh on the neck was visible because the hair had been combed up and piled in a business-like fashion on top of the head. A few errant wisps sprouted out attractively like the spread tail feathers of a bird. The girl was studying a flowchart as Bond came in, but she turned swiftly and fixed him with a piercing blue eye. Her forehead was high, her nose straight, and her mouth was wide and faintly supercilious. There was an authoritative set to her jaw, and the whole face had a stern wariness about it that was at odds with the soft feminine curves of her well-shaped breasts. The impression that Bond got was that here was a woman who wanted to be treated like a man, or thought she did. He had met the type before in male-dominated societies. As personal assistants, they began to take on the characteristics of their bosses. "Good afternoon," said Bond. "I'm looking for Dr. Goodhead." The girl advanced towards him. "You just found her." The smile was a formality. "A woman?" Bond reflected that he could have made more effort to keep the surprise out of his voice. The girl inclined her head graciously. "Your powers of observation do you credit, Mr. Bond. It is Mr. Bond, isn't it?" "James to my friends," said Bond. The girl extended her hand briskly. "Holly Goodhead." The hand was firm and dry, but the pressure it exerted minimal. It was a very formal handshake. "Are you one of the astronaut trainees?" asked Bond. Holly parted her lips slightly as if she had experienced a twinge of pain. "I'm fully trained by NASA, the Space Administration. They assigned me here." She looked at Bond levelly for an instant and then moved towards the door. "Come, Mr. Bond. I'll show you around. You don't want to lose time as well as a space shuttle, do you?" Bond shook his head ruefully as he followed his guide. It seemed that a good friend was hard to find at the Drax Corporation. His acquaintance with Dr. Holly Goodhead had not started off memorably. The first hangar they visited was where a Moonraker was being assembled. Holly showed a pass, and after 2 soundproof doors had been opened, they were in a gigantic workshop with the air full of the smell of welding equipment and the output of the light sources accentuated by the blaze of torches. The framework of the shuttle rose in the air like a rocket, and at all levels men were working on the scaffolding that surrounded it, like bees crawling over a honeycomb. "Each of these men is a specialist technician," explained Holly above the noise. "They could be teaching at MIT if they weren't here." "There seems to be an enormous amount of activity," said Bond. "Do they always work at this rate?" "Mr. Drax has set some pretty tough completion dates. He wants to get a test program into space by the end of next month." Bond gazed upwards and felt awe as he realized what he was looking at. A craft that when finished would be able to perform an almost limitless number of orbits of the Earth, and yet return to base and land like a conventional aircraft. No parachutes. No spheres plummeting into the ocean and relying on a fast destroyer to retrieve them. He watched a medusa of coloured wires being hauled aloft and marvelled at man's ingenuity. What he was seeing made him resolve to temper his dislike of Hugo Drax with respect for what he was doing. To place his resources at the service of mankind was an act of supreme generosity. It far outweighed any personal mannerisms that Bond might find objectionable. Bond thought again and frowned. There was the question of the bugging device in the bedroom. That he did find difficult to reconcile. Holly recited a list of statistics that Bond tried to absorb and then led the way through another set of connecting doors to another vast hangar. An elevator took them up to a catwalk, and from there they could look down on a group of trainee astronauts clustered around what seemed like the cockpit of an aeroplane affixed to a transfusion system of wires and jointed rods. As Bond watched, a trainee climbed into the cockpit and seated himself at the controls, which represented, Holly informed him, those of a Moonraker. Hardly was he in position than the cockpit began to buck and rock. Bond looked at Holly anxiously. She brushed a wisp of her hair behind an ear calmly. "You're watching a flight simulator," she told him. "It can replicate every possible problem contingency that might arise under actual flying conditions." The simulator suddenly shot forward and rose steeply into the air with the metal rods bending grotesquely like the limbs of a stick insect. A television camera moved in synchronism over a nearby panorama of the Earth's surface. The fuselage slipped backwards and lurched sideways like the chamber of a revolver turning as the gun was fired. Bond was not sorry to be standing where he was. He looked across at the opposite catwalk and saw the oval bulk of Chang observing him balefully. The figure folded its arms as if in contemplation, and then turned and disappeared through a shadowy doorway. "Technical competence is of course vital," said Holly, as if repeating a lecture she had given many times. "However, no subject can perform at optimum unless he or she is in a state of peak physical fitness." She looked at Bond pointedly as she said the last words, and for a moment he wondered if she had read his medical report. "What we are going to see next covers this aspect of preparation." Bond said nothing but moved with Holly into the nearest elevator, which deposited them before a door with the word gymnasium emblazoned on it. Beyond the open door was a space which could have contained a football pitch and still left plenty of room for a couple of thousand spectators. It was equipped with vaulting horses, ropes, wooden bars, and all the paraphernalia that Bond remembered from his school days. Half a dozen very pretty girls in the now familiar black leotards were working out on the parallel bars under the tuition of a barrel-chested instructor. Bond looked at them appreciatively. "Astronaut trainees?" Holly looked at him sharply. "Do I detect a note of disapproval?" "It was certainly not intentional," said Bond honestly. "Perhaps in the past I might have been guilty of thinking that there were enough heavenly bodies in space." The corners of Holly's mouth pinched together disapprovingly. "Forgive me for saying so, but I find that kind of schoolboy humour particularly obnoxious, Mr. Bond. There is more to being an astronaut than the ability to wear heavy boots." "Of course," said Bond. Holly had not finished. "There are many ways in which women are better suited for space than men. They are more patient, their ability to rationalize a situation is often far more highly developed than a man's, their aural visual senses are in no way inferior in the matter of smell." "I know," said Bond. "Women smell better than men." Holly looked at him coldly. "I think your persistent recourse to bad jokes is a kind of defense mechanism. Let's test your eyesight, Mr. James Bond 007, License to Kill." Before Bond could reply, she had turned her back and was stalking towards a long, narrow chamber not unlike a shooting gallery. At the far end, Bond could see a number of charts bearing rows of letters in diminishing sizes. He sighed and walked towards the gallery. Holly was waiting for him, bustling with eagerness. It was the first emotion she had shown since their meeting. "Let's take the chart in the middle," she said. "I don't suppose you have any trouble reading the top line?" Bond tilted his head to one side. "X, H, Y." "Good," said Holly briskly. "If you couldn't read that, you wouldn't qualify for a driving license. Now, read me out the bottom line of letters on that card." "The bottom line?" said Bond. His tone suggested that the task would be a challenge for any man. "That's what I said." Holly's eyes threw down the gauntlet. Bond took a deep breath and leant forward, narrowing his eyes to slits. There was a long pause. "It's not easy, is it?" said Holly bossily. Bond's eyes screwed up some more and his neck imitated that of a tortoise tempted by a particularly succulent morsel of lettuce. "P-R-I," he began. "No!" Holly's cry of triumph was almost a shout. "You must be guessing, Mr. Bond." She screwed up her eyes eagerly and started jotting letters down on a pad. "Now, let's see how we compare." She advanced to the chart and looked back over her shoulder. I'm sorry, the last line reads OCBHAX. You amaze me, said Bond. His tone had suddenly thrown away its mantle of deference. He stalked down the aisle and plucked the card out of his holder. I'm afraid you're wrong, Holly. The last line on this chart says printed in Des Moines. He pointed to the small print on the bottom right-hand corner of the chart. I think you'll find that makes the last 3 letters PRI. He looked into Holly's eyes and after a couple of seconds allowed his arrogant face to relapse into a smile. You look pretty when you blush, Dr. Goodhead, he said. Now, what are you going to show me next? Holly said little until they had passed into the next chamber, and Bond enjoyed the silence. He reckoned that he was just ahead in the game, but that Holly Goodhead was not a girl who liked to give up easily. She looked up at him calmly and indicated the structure they were facing. This is the centrifuge, trainer. It simulates the acceleration you would have to withstand on being shot into space. Bond looked at the futuristic fuselage on the end of the long arm and was reminded of something from the fairground. The whip, it had been called, capable of spinning faster and faster with the jointed end performing body-breaking contortions. He looked up and saw the broad expanse of glass that formed the front of what must obviously be the control room. With a slight start of surprise, he saw the diagonal slits that marked Chang's eyes looking down on him. Perhaps you'd like to try it? Holly was looking down at him with a fresh challenge in her eyes. I'd be delighted. Bond's statement was hyperbole, but there was no way he was going to concede ground to Holly Goodhead. A technician stepped forward and the front of the fuselage snapped back like a dragon's mouth. Bond found himself settling into a claustrophobically small space with his knees pushed up against his chest. Holly leant forward and there was a certain relish in the way in which she secured a safety strap across his shoulders. Bond sniffed her scent with obvious appreciation. Joy? Her reply, if it could be deemed a reply, was unequivocal. Put your arms on the seat rests. In a short time these two were securely anchored. Like any man denied the use of his arms, Bond began to feel uneasy. What's that for? Holly smiled at him. It occurred to Bond that she probably enjoyed tying knots about men as much as she enjoyed tying them in knots. To stop you knocking yourself out. Bond's apprehensions were in no way diminished. How fast does this thing go? Holly stepped back and dusted her hands. 3 Gs is equivalent to takeoff acceleration. She smiled kittenishly. It can go up to 20 Gs, but that would be fatal. Most people pass out at 7. Bond tested the strength of the straps that bound him. You'd make a great saleswoman. For the first time, Holly's features relaxed into the ghost of a genuine smile. You don't have to worry. That's what we call a chicken switch. She indicated a column rising from the floor to stop within reach of Bond's right hand. There was a button set in the end of it. Start off by holding that column with your finger pressed down on the button. The moment the pressure gets too much for you, release the button. The power will be cut off immediately. Bond looked skeptically into Holly's clear blue eyes. Immediately? Her jaw tightened scornfully. Surely you're not nervous, Mr. Bond. A 70-year-old can withstand 3 Gs. Bond twisted his head and tried to look up to the control room. Trouble is, there's never a 70-year-old about when you want one. Holly interpreted Bond's glance as one that sought reassurance. Don't worry, Mr. Bond. You're in good hands. A telephone rang and a technician answered it and called Holly over. She spoke for a few seconds and then returned to Bond. Mr. Drax wants to see me. I'll be right back. She transmitted a brief sardonic smile like a flash of semaphore. Enjoy yourself. Bond watched her and the technician leave the room and felt doubt deepen into unease. He had felt less than entirely welcome since his arrival at Drax's isolated desert estate. If an accident was to befall him, what better moment for it to happen? He tried to reach the straps that were securing his arms, but his fingers could only reach the chicken switch. He pumped it in time with his accelerating heartbeat, waiting warily for the power to be switched on. A low humming noise vibrated through the fuselage, and slowly at first the rotor arm began to turn on its central axis. Bond braced himself and watched the walls of the room disappear into a continuous blur. The G-force spread him against the seat like putty, and he gritted his teeth as a piercing whining noise orchestrated the top-like spinning of the fuselage. This was it, the whip of his childhood days, but revolving at a speed that would have torn the original from its moorings and hurled it halfway across the fairground. He forced himself to look down and saw on the counter that he had already passed 4 Gs. The rate of build-up surprised him. The pulverizing pace was increasing with every second. There was a frenzied singing in Bond's ears, and the piercing shriek of the centrifuge was like a nail being driven into his brain. Past 5 Gs now. Honor was satisfied. Not without an effort, Bond lifted his thumb from the button. Nothing happened. Bond waited an instant but saw that the button had indeed risen. He cried out but was unable to hear his own voice. The centrifugal force was holding him in an invisible vice. Only pain had freedom of movement through his body. His tortured, throbbing eyes looked down. 6 Gs. Now he knew what was happening. They were going to kill him. Holly Goodhead had been opportunely called away. The brutal slab of menace that was Chang had done the rest. No doubt there would be mutual recriminations and many regrets. Terror, rage and desperation burned through Bond like a forest fire. He fought to apply pressure against the straps that held him, but the centrifugal force made the raising of an eyebrow a labour of Hercules. 7 Gs. Most people pass out at 10. He remembered Holly's words and the mocking look in her eyes. Was he going to be like most people? Like hell he was. The noise of the centrifuge was now a high-pitched screech that broke the mind apart like an ice pick. The blur before Bond's eyes was grey tinged with red. He felt as if every drop of blood was draining from his face. As if his eyeballs themselves were being pushed into his head. He opened his mouth to scream and felt his lips being pulled across his paralysed cheeks as if smeared by a giant hand. No sound emerged. 8 Gs. His head was going to explode and a shockwave of nausea and dizziness churned through his stomach. Bond knew that he had seconds to live before he lost consciousness, and with it, his life. He must do something. He must not give up the fight. His eyes glued to the counter suddenly saw the strap around his wrist, the strap that Q had given him in the operations room. The sleeve of his jacket had ridden halfway up his forearm and now clung like a second skin. Bond felt a stab of hope, if he could somehow jerk back his wrist. Finger by finger, Bond broke apart his clenched fist and extended his hand along the arm of the seat. Every movement required a force that was borrowed from the will to survive rather than any strength that could escape the death hug of the centrifuge. If he could fire down the rotor arm, it would be like striking at the head of the octopus. His teeth ground together so that he expected to feel slivers of enamel in his mouth. He fought the pain and the mind-splitting wail and strove to prise his fingers from the seat arm. As if held by adhesive, the fingers trembled and then snapped clear to rise half an inch in the air. The thumb lagged behind. Bond summoned up all his remaining strength of spirit and will for the supreme effort. The black curtain flecked with red was being drawn for the last time. He dragged down his eyelids and his wrist ached. Fingers spread like a maimed spider making its death stand. Crack! Bond's eyes were closed, but the flash shone through the lids like the torchlight playing on a blind. There was a deafening explosion and a crazed grinding noise that faded with the imperishable resonance of a steel heel being dragged across asphalt. As quickly as it had taken hold, Bond felt the grip loosening. His body detached itself from the seat and he came away like a sticky sweet from its wrapping. Sweat lathered his aching body. He was within half a breath of voiding the contents of his stomach. The hatch snapped open and hands tore at the straps that stopped him from slumping forward. He heard Holly's voice above the others and pulled up his head to open his eyes. Holly was looking at him, aghast. What happened? It was difficult to doubt the concern on her face. Difficult, but not impossible. Bond opened his dry mouth and tried to find some saliva to lubricate his words. Something must have gone wrong with the controls. Holly's voice was incredulous. She stretched out a supporting hand as Bond started to pull himself out of the seat. Let me help you. Bond brushed the hand aside. No thanks, Doctor. I think I've had enough treatment for one day.